This is Randall Root, and in this video we will be taking a look at Mdx basics. In order for us to be able to work with this particular set of demos I'm going to display, you all have had to have installed the Pubs BI Cubes database, which I covered the installation of by restoring the database file in the setting up the Mdx demo video. So if you haven't watched that yet, I would recommend you do so. You'll find it in the same location as you found this one. So to demonstrate this, I actually wrote a chapter on the subject in one of my books. And I'm going to go ahead and use that, since that's kind of one of the reasons why I wrote it, to talk about this particular subject. This is the 14th chapter of my book, Professional BI Solutions Using SQL Server 2012 by A-Press. Anyway, the first thing I want to talk about is keys, concepts, and terms. So when you're working with Mdx, it's very different in a lot of ways than working with Transact SQL. It has some similarities, but there's certainly enough differences that actually can kind of give you a headache to some degree as you try to switch between the two. First thing to note is kind of the way the cube thinks of the organization of data. So when you're working with a cube, you identify which measures you want to look at and then which dimensions you want to work with. And you can think of the dimensions as having a hierarchical structure, such as a typical date hierarchy would include things like the date, and you'd have an individual member of that date dimension. It would also be a member of that level, if you would, level of the hierarchy. So the date, January 1st, 1992 in this example, it would be, part of the date level and the date dimension. And it would be considered a child of a particular month. So there would be a level called month, and it would have a member that was January of 1992. Which would be considered a child of the first quarter of 1992 at the quarter level, which would be considered a child of the year 1992 at the year level, which would be considered, you guessed it, a child of all the years at the all level. There is always an all level. It's implied unless you're working with measures. Measures do not have a all level, but in Mdx programming they are considered a dimension. So because of the structure, you can use various different functions to identify individual members of a dimension by saying things like the child of a particular year, or the grandparent, or the parent, or the child of the child of the child, and navigate through the hierarchy. There's even functions for identifying siblings. So other children of the same parent, and even, oddly enough, cousins, children of your siblings. So it's a very interesting language, and it has a lot of features that allows you to navigate through this hierarchical structure. When you're creating the cube and you make your dimensions and to go along with the cube, you're probably used to, at that point, looking at the dimension in a format similar to this. Each different attribute is listed over here on the side. Excuse me a second. Each different attribute is identified here on the side. I keep highlighting things by mistake here. I really don't want to do that. So I'll put it in read mode just to make it a little less likely for me to make that mistake. Okay, so as I was saying, each attribute is listed over here on the left, and then you have your custom hierarchies that you would have built, and that would have all come from data in like a data source, like a data warehouse dimension table. This is just one way of looking at it. When we start getting into working with MDX expressions, we've got concepts like dimensions and measures and members. So a dimension, of course, is a way of grouping attributes together, and measures are the values that you have in a fact table that you want to go through and query against. So I want to see if the sales quantity or the inventory counts or how many times somebody came to a web page or service. That would all be something I'd measure. Members are the individual values of a dimension, including the measures dimension. So the particular date, such as January 1st, 1992, that's an individual member of the date dimension. But actually a particular value in a measure would also be a member of that, the measures dimension. So it's just an individual value from the dimension. And that includes, of course, any member of a level or hierarchy. The measure dimension, as I mentioned, is special in that, yes, it is a dimension, but it has no all level. There is no such thing as an all grouping. And there are measure groups. This is just a way of organizing your measures into groups. In most dimensions, you'll have a all member. That's a way of identifying the grand total of all the items in a given dimension. This is also true of hierarchies. And attributes are, properties of a member or combination of members. Now, attributes are considered additional identifiers of dimension features, such as the product name or the product ID or the product's price, etc. Attributes are just additional descriptors beyond just the actual key of that dimension, such as the product key. So it turns out that attribute is a logical collection of one or more values that would come from a column. An example of that would be that the product key of the product's dimension may also be used as part of the attribute, but the product name would be as well. So the attribute can have multiple facets. Usually it will have a key and a name. This will make more sense once we start programming. And of course, there is a hierarchical structure of most attribute values. Well, excuse me, I guess all attributes values would have that. Sometimes the hierarchical structure is very simple. So for example, an individual attribute will have a all level and then the individual members of the actual attribute. And other times it'll have more complex, such as the one I showed in the diagram, in which case we have days and months and quarters and years. Once again, this will make more sense after we start programming. And we did talk about the relationships, familiar relationships, such as parent and child and cousins and siblings, etc. And certainly there are those terms that we'll need to talk about. When you get a chance, I would come back and look at these definitions after you've done some programming. They make a lot more sense afterwards. So my recommendation is just kind of scan through there currently. And then once you've got a little bit more experience of how to work with MDX, then come back and look at this. The next thing we're going to do is look at programming in MDX, and we'll start with the very, very basics. The first thing to learn is probably how to write a comment in MDX code. And actually there's three ways of doing so. In Transact SQL, there's only two. There is the double dash option, and then there is the slash star slash block comment. MDX has both of those, just like a standard SQL language comment, but they also have the double slash, which is a C style comment, and you can use all three. So that's pretty easy. That's a good place to start. The basic syntax is not too hard either. It looks a little weird at first, but you'll get the hang of it. The basic syntax is select from where, and instead of just putting like a star, you indicate how you would like to get your results back. What would you like to show across columns or across rows, and from which cube? It's a little verbose in its syntax in that it has things like curly braces and a lot of square brackets and number of parentheses, etc. But the basic pattern is somewhat similar to the SQL language if you've programmed in that. If you haven't, MDX is probably not your best place to get started. So I would recommend taking a look at various tutorials on SQL programming, standard Transact SQL or just regular SQL programming. Transact SQL is Microsoft's version of the SQL language with extra features added. But it's pretty much the standard SQL, 80% of it anyway. So a couple things to note, that instead of using a table name, you're going to be using the name of the cube. So that's definitely one thing to note. You'll see a lot of curly braces and semicolons inside of an Mdx statement. That is very normal. You'll see that happening in Mdx, whereas you would not normally see that in Transact SQL, although the semicolon is pretty common in standard SQL languages. And certainly the on columns and on rows, those are definitely not typical in standard SQL queries, but they are used in MDX. In fact, they are required, as we'll see a little later on, or at least on columns, and what it represents is required. A standard Mdx statement would look like this, where I'd go through and say select sales quantity from the measures dimension and place it across the columns. Or columns actually an alias for the zeroth access of the results coming back. And I'd also like to see from the titles dimension at the title level, or attribute I should say, I'd like to see the title is Anger the Enemy, and I'd like to have that results sent back to me on the first axis, or the rows. It's also an alias, and the rows alias is of course for axis 1. There are actually a lot of different aliases. There's 32 of them. Again, I'll come back and talk a little bit more about that later. Instead of putting the table name, we put in the name of the cube, so cube pub sales. And then if we'd like to filter out the results, we can use a where clause and say, I only want to see results that are coming back if the sales quantity is from the bookstore under the stores dimension, the store attribute. Eric the Red is the member of that. So this would be a way of identifying what items you would like to look at and get a value back. Now, if you're going through this video, you can stop the video at any time and type out the code. You, of course, can look through the PDF file that I'm reviewing right now and type out the code. If you got the PDF file, you could actually copy and paste the code. And to make it even simpler, I've actually included a copy of my code with all the Mdx done for you. But the best way to learn programming is to program. So I would strongly recommend typing out each sample if you've got the time. If you're just doing a quick review of or overview of Mdx programming and you don't have the time to do that, I understand perfectly, but I gotta say it's not the best way to learn. Of course, after you typed out your code, you'd need to run it. So you would run the code by opening up SQL Server Management Studio and entering the Mdx code to a script file. First of all, you'd make a script file, and then, or if you had an existing one, open that, and then once you've typed in the code, you would run it. There's a few buttons here you need to know. It's kind of a busy little screen. There is a reconnect button over here that helps you to kind of get a refresh if something has changed. There is the database selector option. There is a execute button. The hide and results pane isn't actually normally there. I wish Microsoft would have put it there, but they did not. I have added it on, and I will show you in this video how to add it yourself. And what it does is that when you press this button, it will hide the results down here. If you press it again, it will display it again. It'll just toggle back and forth. If you want to make a new MDX query, you can hit the new query button, and if you're connected to an MDX database in Object Explorer, which is kind of hiding out over here, it will automatically make you an MDX query. It looks like it's not highlighting on the picture. If you hit the MDX button, regardless of whether or not you're connected to something in Object Explorer, it'll make you an MDX query, a query window. And if you hit the Save button, those little floppy disk symbols, it will save the MDX query window as a MDX script on your hard drive. What you would normally do is you would open up an MDX window by pressing one of those buttons, focusing on the particular cube that you want to work with, or excuse me, database you want to work with, and then start typing in your code. When you're all done, you would hit the execute button, and then you would review the results that you got back in the results pane here at the bottom. The cube selector and the cube metadata is not actually all that important. If they are on a different cube than the one that you're querying, it won't have any impact. It's just really a kind of a convenience for you to be able to drag and drop certain items from the left-hand side here where the little measure groups are identified, this cube metadata, onto your query window, as I'm going to demonstrate right now. So I've kind of outlined the various different pieces. If you're reading the book, because it's not made for the demo, but the best thing for me to do before we get into the things like optional syntax is just to give you a quick demo how it's going to work. So let me do that. Step one is to open up SQL Server Management Studio. I've already got that open for us. So now I will go and make a new query window by hitting the MDX button. And it will, if I want to zoom in, I can hold down the control button and roll the mouse wheel forward, and I'll be able to zoom in. I would recommend when you're first getting started not trying to type out your code at the smallest font. It's really easy to make mistakes that way. Object Explorer is fully expanded right now, but I don't really need it. It doesn't really do me much good. I can't really drag and drop items from it any better than if I drag and drop the items from the little mini metadata browser here. So I'm not getting a whole lot of extra goodies with that, and I'm going to just put it in auto hide mode by pushing this little push pin button, which will send it in auto hide mode. Gives myself a little bit more real estate. Next, I want to go ahead and write my query. So I will do so. I'll just go ahead and say select from and the name of the cube. And if I didn't feel like typing that in, and I do like this feature, drag and drop it. Notice that the drag and drop feature will put in the square brackets, and square brackets, curly braces, and parentheses is something you see a lot in MDX code. So this would be a start. I'd be able to execute the code. The results are up here at the bottom, and as far as adjusting the toolbar so that it has that hide results option, I will come up here, I will customize the toolbar. I need to know that I'm working with the SQL Server Analysis Server editors. Let me verify that by checking this button, and sure enough, that's what it shows and hides it. So that is the toolbar I'm looking to modify. Let's see, I can place its location here, but really what I want to do is I want to add a command. So I'm going to go over here to Commands, and I'm going to choose Toolbar, and I'm going to choose from this list the, let's see, where are you? Analysis Server Editors. We have the Execute button, we have the Cancel Executing Query, we have a Parse option, and what we're going to do is we're going to add in a command. So we'll hit the Add Command button, and when this dialog window shows up, scroll all the way to the bottom on the left hand side and choose Window, and scroll all the way to the bottom on the right hand side and choose the option that says Show Results Pane. So left all the way to the bottom, Window, right all the way to the bottom, Show Result Pane, and say OK. That will place it here, but of course I want to actually move it down. So you think you'd be able to drag and drop, but that's right. You can just hit the Move Down button until it goes to the place you want. I usually put it pretty close to the Execute button because I'm constantly working with that. And I'll just say Close at this point, and you'll see it show up here. And now I can either show or hide results, which I think is a really nice feature when we're typing in code. So we've got our first statement written. We've tested it. If we'd like to comment it out, we can just put a couple dashes like you would in Transact SQL, and it'll comment out that code. And we can place another statement on the screen. And I think what I'll do is I'll get some practice here by going back and looking at the code either in that image or going back up here and trying to type out the code myself. And again, this is the recommended way I would do it. So I will type out select curly brace on columns. Now you may be wondering why the heck I'm not typing out the stuff in the middle. Well, it's mostly because I'm kind of lazy. I mean, I'm all for typing, but there are times where it's just so nice to not have to type out every single thing. And in my mind, this is one of them. You see, if I can go over here to measures, I can grab a hold of the sales quantity and drag and drop it. It'll type that out. I gotta say, I love that feature. If you've been watching any of my videos, you'll notice that I'm not that great a typer. Typer. Apparently I'm not that great a speaker either. But anyway, I get the job done by doing things like, well, persevering when I'm speaking and doing drag and drop whenever I can when I'm typing. So we've got the first part there, and I'm going to do the same thing on the next one down here. I'm going to go ahead and put a couple curly braces and type in on rows. That's going to represent my first axis. And then from and where. In fact, it would be good to set up a little template so we don't have to do this repeatedly. And I'll show you how to do that in a minute. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I am going to drag and drop, let's see, dim titles, title is anger the enemy, on rows. Okay, let's see if we can find it. It's not a measure, so I'll collapse this and I'll look into the dimensions. Here it is, dim titles. And I'm looking for the title attribute. There it is. And I'm specifically looking for a member. So it looks like I'm going to have to cover this up. I'm looking for is anger the enemy. Members, all, is anger the enemy. Excellent, I found it. Now I can drag that over and drop it in, and it will, wait a second. Now I really do wish Microsoft would change this. They haven't. It's been like this since 2005, a little bit earlier actually. So after almost a decade, chances are it's not going to change anytime soon. But it would have been nice if when you drag and drop it, it gave you the text value instead of the key value. Remember that an attribute, such as title, can represent both the key and the actual key property and the name property. There's also a value property. And when we set the name property, we actually are entering in the human-friendly text. So if I were to, let's see, how should I show you this? Well, let me open up Visual Studio, and I'll show you what I mean. I will connect to I'll connect to the analysis server database. Now you have to be kind of careful with this. What you're going to do is you're going to end up with a live connection. So any changes you make will affect that. I'm going to connect to my local installation. Of course, if I was using a named instance, I'd have to put a slash there and type that in. I'll choose the database we're working with and say OK. And this will give us a live connection to that database with its cube and its dimensions. And if I go looking at the titles dimension, I will see the attribute title. And if I look at the properties there, I'll see that I have set the key column to be the title key and the name column to be title name. And the name column is what displays to the human. There's also, by the way, a value column. You don't set that one as often. It is not like you never use it, but you would seldom use them. So I would, especially at the beginning of your career, I would just focus on the fact that there's a key column and name column for these attributes. And if you don't set a particular name column for a particular attribute, what's going to happen is it's going to default to whatever the key column is. So in my mind, Microsoft would have been better off to display the name column facet of an attribute instead of the key column, but they don't. So what you're getting here is the actual key value of 8 when you drag and drop over here over the is anger the enemy. And that key value, of course, is coming actually from the data warehouse. If I take a look at the contents of the dim titles table, I'll select that data. It should show up here in a second. Or not. Actually, I think what it is that I'm trying to drill in and my configuration isn't correct. I should get an error message here. I did. I'm going to go to Solution Explorer and I'm going to make a change on my data source. Now again, you have to be careful. This represents a live connection. So any changes you make here will affect your live server. I feel pretty comfortable that we're going to be all right with that, but that's something to be aware of. The impersonation information would also have an impact. This one using my old laptop, so that is not what I'm using now. I need to change that too. Okay, now I can try to explore the data. It makes a connection, and I can see that key 8 represents is anger the enemy. And that is why, guys, in our Mdx code, that is why we're getting this. Okay, so we can either live with that, or we can actually type out is anger the enemy. I think that if somebody comes back and looks at our code, and they're trying to figure out what we're typing, if they see the actual human-friendly name, it's going to make them understand what we're looking at or displaying more readily. And so I would actually recommend changing it out. It's kind of tedious that you have to do the typing yourself, but it's not the end of the world. As I'll show you, most applications later on will go through and change those, display the human-friendly names. So when you're using applications to access the data in a cube, the actual name property does indeed show up. So it's not that big a deal, just in the coding aspect. Okay, so the next thing is to go through and indicate the from clause. And once again, I'll drag and drop. And let's see what else we have to do. Let me get back to my PDF file. Oh yes, we need to indicate which store we want to see the results from. Now, right now, if I highlight the code we have here, it will run, but it will give us results regardless of the store. So overall, this particular title is Anger the Enemy has sold 108 copies. But now we're going to put a restriction saying we only want the values from the store Eric the Red. So once again, I'll go looking for that particular value, excuse me, that particular attribute, and then the particular member. Now I could just type it out. It's just that, I don't prefer to. And heck, for that matter, I could just go ahead and use the identifier. But if I had put that in the original code up here, it wouldn't make any much sense to people that were just getting started. So yes, I would actually recommend typing in the name. And then trying your code again. So not too hard. That's kind of the basics of how to get started and how to run your MDX code. What I recommend now is that you continue with the reading. It will indicate how to use optional syntax, and I would go through and type in these various different examples and see how they work. I've just told you about the difference between using key and name identifiers. And there's a small exercise here, in which case you open the connection and type in some MDX code and make sure it works. One thing about MDX, guys, is there's a number of ways to get the same results. So you can write the query in a variety of ways, and that's what this exercise is going to tell you. So that is the basics of MDX. We will take a look at another video here about more advanced topics in MDX, but that will get you started. So if you would, please go through those first few pages trying out the code, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.